The word Quran means either recitation or reading. And within these two possible interpretations of the term Quran is our dilemma. Is the Quran, when it first appeared on the stage of history, sound like a chant or a song, or a text, a book? For the overwhelming majority of history, Muslims have favored the former meaning over the latter. The Quran is a recitation, an oral recital experienced first through the ears. The Quran is a performance, given by an illiterate prophet named Muhammad to a more or less illiterate people, the people of the early 7th century Hijaz, that is, the western side of the Arabian Peninsula. And as far as we can tell, there's no known book written in Arabic or translated into Arabic before the Quran itself. The Quran came into an Arabic milieu where writing was quite uncommon. And so it follows that the Quran is sound and spoken word, and only later became a proper book. And this flat fact echoed out over the centuries from late antiquity to the present. To learn the Quran to a Muslim is to learn to recite the Quran aloud. The written Quran, the Mus'haf, the Codex, is incidental, a useful memory aid like sheet music is to a musician. But things are never so simple. We have to also ask ourselves how the Quran is a reading, a written text. First, within the Quran itself, there are hundreds of direct and indirect allusions to reading, writing, and literacy. God teaches by the pen. The Quran is written on a guarded tablet. It is a clarifying book. If the Quran is, first of all, an oral performance coming out of an unlettered man's mouth to an unlettered people, it's bizarrely concerned with books and bookishness, especially its own. Further still, there are ancient Islamic sources that speak of the Quran as a piece of writing, even in the days of Muhammad. In the traditional narrative of the first revelation of the angel Gabriel presenting Muhammad the Quran is written upon a brocade as text up in the cave of Hira. The angel Gabriel came to me while I was asleep, with a woven cloth with writing on it, and he said, "Recite." There are stories, too, of the future Caliph Umar reading pages of the Quran owned by his sister, or of Muhammad's Christian cousin-in-law, Waraka, writing out biblical texts. And by the by, even the name Waraka refers to a sheet. It's sort of like the English name page. Then there's the bizarre tale of Muhammad's wife Aisha keeping pages of the Quran under her bed, where they were subsequently eaten by an animal, probably a goat. So, if the Quran first appeared as a purely oral recital in a very oral environment, the first Muslim histories we have of it seem to disagree. And another further step, we now have physical evidence of written copies of the Quran which may actually date to Muhammad's own lifetime. The most famous of these is the so-called Birmingham Quran, which has been radiocarbon dated to between the years 568 and 645 of the Christian calendar, almost perfectly overlapping with the Prophet's own traditional dating, from 570 to 632. Assuming the radiocarbon dating can be trusted, which is always a problem, the person who wrote these pages lived in Muhammad's world, or was very, very close to it. And what we have on these two sheets are sections of Quran, chapters 18, 19, and 20, in that order, meaning that already in Muhammad's time, there was a canonized, written text of the Quran with sections arranged identically with how they're arranged today. And then we have to take yet another step. Thanks to the ubiquity of digital camera phones and geomapping, we are daily uncovering ever more pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabian inscriptions. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of inscriptions in several alphabets, styles, and Arabian languages have been recorded, throwing Muhammad's whole world squarely into the sphere of literacy, not orality. And so the problem. Is the Quran oral or literary? A recitation or a reading? If one tries to argue that the Quran is coming from an illiterate, highly oral culture, one must disregard the epigraphic evidence carved in stone, Quranic manuscripts which can be dated, many ancient sources that speak of the Quran as a written document, and most especially, you have to ignore the Quran's own repeated assertion that it's a kitab, a book sent by God who guides humanity through the use of pens and pages. But if you say the Quran is coming from a literary culture, that the Quran is a composition on paper, well then you fly in the face of centuries of Islamic tradition, and books beyond number that claimed that Muhammad was unlettered and his culture controlled by bards and poets, not scribes. So how do we move forward? Is the Quran a book or a chant, a talk or a text, a recitation or a reading? Whatever we conclude, we have some explaining to do. If you're a modern scholar, say an anthropologist, and you want to know something about oral cultures, you get on a plane and you go to ask someone from that culture that you're interested in. And if you're doing your scholarship well and keeping notes, you can reach into your pocket, take out your handy-dandy notebook, or tape recorder, or a smartphone, and record what your informant has to say. And sure enough, scholars working in a wide variety of settings have done just that. Starting in the 1920s with Milman Parry and Albert Lord's famous studies of Yugoslav bards, modern scholars have studied oral cultures from Japan to Panama to Somalia with recording devices in hand. That is, if you want to understand a living oral tradition, you just ask someone who actually lives in that tradition. Things get a little harder, though, if you want to study a dead oral culture. And the reason is simple. Any ancient text you encounter is, by definition, the artifact of a literate person. So, if you want to know more about an ancient oral culture, say, for instance, the culture of 7th century Arabia, the only evidence that you have has come from literary people. In short, if you want to learn more about ancient orality, you start by asking the exact wrong people. It would be like trying to learn about deaf culture in America by only listening to hearing people talk out loud. Sound, unlike text, is ephemeral. It goes away in an instant. I say these words and now they no longer exist. And now these words, and they no longer exist. And so on, forever. It's a simple observation, to be sure, but it makes all the difference in the world. If you live in a time and place where reading and writing is unknown, which is of course most of human history in most places, words, thoughts, and knowledge only exist as much as you can remember them. For the most part, memory is all you have. If you live in the world before or beyond the advent of recording technologies, and you have a conversation with your friend, your memory of that conversation is all there is to work with. If you forget some detail that she said, it's gone. And if you forget that you forgot some detail, it never existed in the first place. In a purely oral culture, a culture in which recording is utterly unknown, the only data that exists is the data that some living, present person actually knows. Data requires a brain to hold it. And so it follows that if you value some information, you're going to have to put a lot of time and effort into remembering it. Memory is the only way to preserve complicated knowledge from the past, whether ancient times or a few minutes ago. Nothing can be looked up. Nothing can be stored. If there was some great tribal hero who a century ago saved your people from their enemies, and no one remembers this hero anymore, then the hero never existed in the first place. If someone, somewhere, doesn't remember something, it never happened. There's only memory and oblivion. And so naturally, living in a world like this, as opposed to our world, is going to affect how you think. We've all heard the early modern riddle about a tree falling in the woods. If a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, I would imagine that for most of us it's kind of a silly question. Of course it makes a sound. Sound exists whether there are ears to hear it or not. Scientific forces are still there, the natural world works in its regular, predictable way, and so when a tree falls, there's a sound. Now, if a person from a purely oral culture were to consider the riddle, it would strike them a little bit more powerfully. It isn't that they would necessarily conclude anything different about whether there was a sound or not, but the question would be much more fascinating. What does it mean to have a sound without a mind to sense it or an ear to hear it? In a purely oral culture, this is something you literally never encounter. You can't. Knowledge implies a living, breathing person who knows it. History can only come from someone who remembers it. A sound only exists because some mind is receiving it. We today are totally used to the idea that information exists outside of the human mind. We encounter disembodied data all the time in recordings, art, film, and texts. We encounter it so much that it's actually reshaped how our brains interact with the world around us. We kind of just assume that data exists out there, somewhere, regardless of if anyone actually knows it or not. We think of information itself as if it was written down on some unseen tablet, which we might call factuality or history. We forget that the way that we think is the product of long centuries of exposure to various technologies of recording. And we forget it so well that we forget that we've forgotten. We fail to realize that thinking this way, that information, stories, histories, and thoughts are fixed into reality itself, is really odd. Most people for most of time didn't think this way. Our thought patterns and assumptions about information are, frankly, very weird. And we didn't just learn to think this way overnight either. Let me show you what I mean. People need to be surrounded by recording technologies for a very long time before they get used to the idea that stories and knowledge don't need to necessarily be in any specific person's memory. It isn't just that illiterate people think one way and literate people think another. It's a slow, gradual transformation from a more oral way of thinking to our own, more literate way of thinking. Somewhere in the very remote past of the human race, we can imagine a state of pure orality. No writing, no reading, no art, no meaningful carving. No possibility for any abstract thought or complicated data to exist outside of a particular living person. In time, some cultures started to develop certain technologies to correct this problem. First, craftwork and other forms of art helped people remember the past. And then eventually, there came the means to record words with these scratches and images, pictograms. And in some places, these developed into the first proper writing systems in China, Egypt, and Mesopotamia most especially. Each of these cultures found ways to make a fixed image stand in for a word or a thought. But there's a catch. Because these early recording systems used pictures to stand in for words, there was no way to reliably interpret the picture if you didn't already know it. You could only learn the meaning of a recording system if a living person taught it to you. Some other person would have to teach you what each image, scratch, and stroke meant. The time it would take to learn to read in a reliable way would therefore be much, much slower and much more time-consuming than it would be for us. And so very few people naturally could invest their time this way. Centuries later, these and some other cultures refined their systems of recording to create syllabary or alphabetic systems, where the images don't stand in for words, but instead stand in for sounds. And that's where the breakthrough comes. Languages like Sanskrit or Greek can be sounded out. You don't have to memorize hundreds of images to read and write. Just a small handful of letters is enough. And these can be reconfigured to make the sounds of the words you need. So, if you are reading or writing, and you encounter a word that you've never seen written before, you can sound it out. You don't need to learn it from another living person. If you know your letters and you speak the language in question, you can figure out how to proceed and how to interpret. And that little difference makes all the difference, because now we have thoughts that can be completely detached from a living human being. You can learn a word that no one ever taught you. you can write a word that no one has ever written before, and someone you've never met could possibly read and understand it. So people with alphabetic systems of recording are going to start getting used to this idea that a thought can exist out there, outside of a particular human mind. It can be stored in stone, paint, or paper. It can be interpreted correctly by someone who never met its author, and perhaps lived generations after the author died. In writing, you can listen to the sounds of strangers and the sounds of the dead. Using the words of Walter Ong, we're going to call this next step high residual orality. High residual orality is a culture in which some people are literate, but the recording system of the culture still gives the most priority to sound and speech. Likewise, even though reading and writing are around, people aren't using them most of the time. So people are still thinking like a purely oral mind. Therefore, data needs to be stored at all costs. They're used to memorizing things and not accustomed to disembodied words and thoughts. Since most people don't have the time, the funds, or for that matter, the need to develop literacy, the residual oral mind doesn't assume literacy is normal either. Like programming languages in our own culture, recording technologies in a residually oral culture would only be used in a very specific setting, and you wouldn't assume that just anyone could have access to what was recorded. The residual oral culture is one where writing and reading exist, and they're useful, but they're still kind of novelties. And even if you're literate, your brain treats them as such. Technology develops a bit more, until writing systems are more or less standardized, and the materials that you need to read and write are cheap and easy to come by. This is the chirographic culture, when people start to assume writing is normal. Sure, there are still plenty of illiterate people around, but writing is common enough that it's more or less assumed. The town crier gives way to the pamphlet and the newspaper. The oral poet gives way to the novel. And if you don't know something or other, you can look it up. You can ask someone without actually speaking to another living person. And then you get to cultures and ways of thinking that are like our own. Not only are reading and writing assumed and standardized, there are many different ways of recording both sights and sounds. Photographs, records, CDs, smartphones, Twitter, and movies. You can literally see and hear an experience of a person that you've never met. You can record mostly anything that's happening to you as it's happening. This is the technographic culture, where not only can words and art get recorded, they can be recorded in many ways by anyone, even an illiterate person, in an instant. And so back to my earlier questions about the Quran and the world into which it first appeared in the 7th century. We aren't just asking if it's a literary culture or an oral one. We're asking how literate they are, in what senses of the term literate, and how a given individual's mind is responding to these various forms of recording and literacy. We aren't just asking if the Quran, or any document for that matter, is a recording or a recitation. We are asking, what does the mind of the Quran and its audience think about reading and recitation? And my response to this: the Quran appears in a world with a high oral residue. Reading and writing exist in Arabic, and people know about them, and some people even use them regularly. But the Quranic mind, that is, the mind of the Quran's narrator and the mind of those in his audience, are much, much more oral than literate. And that's our larger problem. Our minds are overwhelmingly literate. We today have technographic minds. Sure, you can learn ancient Arabic or other Semitic languages and read the Quran, but you're still translating it. You're still transporting it into an artificial environment that warps its meanings and corrupts your data set. And there's a sad irony in all this, that the overwhelming majority of the world's peoples have lived in purely oral or highly oral cultures, and thus their brains were designed to accommodate that. Yet, we're the odd ones out here. We are the most literate of the literate-brained. We read constantly, and that goes double if you're an academic like I am. And so, how do we translate? We are completely completely unlike the minds of the original audience, and so translation still is a problem, even when language is not. How do we bridge this gap, not of language but of mind, and thus make contact with a document like the Quran, or, for that matter, the documents of most of the human race?